Hey everyone, it's your guy coming at you with a reality check on what's really happening around the world. And trust me, this one hits close to home for all of us. Right now, extreme heat is hammering countries everywhere. And here's the thing, the first thing that breaks isn't people, it's the power grid. We saw it right here in the US. Texas has been blasting emergency alerts, literally begging residents to cut back on AC usage, asking people to crank their thermostats up to 78 degrees or higher just to keep the system from collapsing entirely. Over in parts of Asia, when the heat and dry season hit, factories have to shut down just so homes can have electricity, and the economic damage is brutal, costing billions in lost production, delayed shipments, and idle assembly lines. That's when you realize 1 kilowatt hour looks tiny and insignificant, but behind that single unit of electricity is the entire industrial backbone of a nation. Without reliable juice, nothing moves, no manufacturing, no data centers, no hospitals, no subways, no water treatment plants, no nothing. It's the lifeblood of modern civilization, plain and simple. Now think about your own life. Whether it's a monsoon dumping sheets of rain or a blistering heat wave, baking the pavement outside, your AC stays at a comfortable 74 degrees. Your fridge keeps food cold, your TV keeps you entertained, and your bill pocket change. About 7 cents per kilowatt hour where we're talking about. So why is it that China seems to sail right through these weather nightmares? These once-in-a-century storms that now show up every other year, while others, including parts of our own country, struggle to keep the lights on and people safe. Today, I'm breaking down 3 big questions. What really makes China's power system a beast that dwarfs pretty much everyone else? Why it's not just about generating electricity, that's actually the easy part. And the real secret sauce, a grid that handles the needs of 1.4 billion people and the world's biggest factories without breaking a sweat, no matter what Mother Nature throws at it. Stick with me, because this gets wild, and it matters more than you might think. Let's start abroad. Because the contrast is jaw-dropping and honestly a little embarrassing for the developed world, in May of 2026, India's power load hit 270.8 gigawatts, 4 straight days of record-breaking demand that pushed every substation to its limit. And then some, by early July, the heat wave was still raging. Temperatures hovering near 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the grid was gasping for air like a marathon runner at the finish line, completely out of breath. Once the sun went down, solar generation died poof, gone in an instant, and the supply gap exploded immediately like a bomb going off, leaving millions in the dark. The city of Chennai went dark 40 to 60 minutes every single night. Imagine your whole city shutting down for an hour every evening. Traffic lights dead, hospitals running on backup generators, people stuck in elevators. Rural areas saw 10 plus hours of outages daily. That's more than half the day in the dark. No fans, no water pumps, no way to charge phones. Imagine 52 degrees Celsius, that's about 125 degrees Fahrenheit in a New Delhi slum with tin roofs and no power. That's not living. That's survival horror. Plain and simple. One poultry farm lost 5,000 chickens in just 3 hours without electricity, just cooked alive in their own coops, because the ventilation stopped and the heat became unbearable. That's the human and economic cost of a fragile grid. And it's not a pretty picture. India's still developing. So maybe you give them a pass and say they've got time to catch up, but look at our own backyard, the United States of America, the most powerful economy on the planet. January of 2026, a polar vortex slammed Tennessee, leaving over 230,000 customers without power. And people literally froze to death in their own homes. Unable to heat their houses while thermometers plunged below zero, pipes bursting, families huddling under blankets. Then fast forward to late June and early July, when extreme heat hit Texas and California again. Or grids were on life support. And we saw the same old story repeat itself. Urgent pleas for conservation, rolling blackouts that hit neighborhoods without warning, and social media blowing up with frustrated homeowners venting their anger. And here's the part that really gets me, the part that keeps me up at night. The Department of Energy itself warned that by 2030, the average American could see more than 2 hours of outages per day, with blackout risk multiplying by 100 times compared to today. A superpower forecasting its own daily darkness in just a few years. That's not exactly reassuring for us, is it? That's not a third world problem, that's our problem. And it's getting worse, not better. Now look at Europe, because they're not doing much better. France's nuclear plants, which they've always bragged about as the backbone of their energy independence, had to throttle down because cooling water got too hot rivers, literally too warm to safely cool reactors. So they had to cut output at the worst possible time. And electricity prices went absolutely ballistic. spiking to levels that made people's jaws drop. Belgium's spot prices spiked to the equivalent of about $1.25 per kilowatt hour. That's about 18 times what we pay in China for residential power. Can you believe that? Germany? They brag about negative prices sometimes, which sounds great in headlines. But the real bill that hits your mailbox is all taxes and fees, around 20 cents per kilowatt hour, forcing people to set alarms at midnight just to run their washing machines and dishwashers to save a few bucks. Because daytime rates are simply unaffordable for many households. So we're not alone in this mess, but the contrast is glaring while the developed world is scrambling, making desperate pleas and watching their infrastructure crumble. One country seems to have figured something out, something fundamental that the rest of us missed. So when extreme weather is the new normal, and let's be honest, it's not going away, it's accelerating the fact that we can chill in air-conditioned. Comfort isn't just about lifestyle or convenience. It's proof that social order doesn't collapse. Hospitals keep running without skipping a beat, factories keep producing and exporting, and supply chains don't snap under pressure the way they do elsewhere. That's real defensive power, and honestly, it's something we in America should be paying close attention to, because it speaks to resilience at a national scale. The kind of resilience that determines whether a country can weather a crisis or crumble under it. Now, some folks think China doesn't have blackouts just because they burn more coal or have more rivers. That's the lazy explanation you hear from talking heads who haven't looked at the data. That's dead wrong. The global truth is, blackouts aren't about not generating enough there, about not delivering enough, or people simply can't afford the bill when it spikes. Equating electricity with generation capacity is the biggest misunderstanding of China's energy strategy. And frankly, a lazy take that misses the whole picture and underestimates what they've actually built. In 2025, China's total electricity consumption hit 10.4 trillion kilowatt hours, the first time any country in human history has ever crossed that massive, mind-boggling mark. Let that sink in for a second. 10.4 trillion. Global total is about 28.6 trillion kilowatt hours. China alone accounts for over 1/3 of that, more than the EU, Russia, India, and Japan combined. That's not just big, that's historically unprecedented. And it happened in a country that was largely agrarian just a few decades ago. And they're still accelerating. By July of 2026, installed capacity officially broke 40.1 gigawatts, making China the first nation to pierce that 40 gigawatt ceiling, 1.7 times the combined capacity of the EU and the US put together. Their average annual growth rate was 9.7%. Compare that to Russia at 1.2%, the US at 1.7%, Japan at 2.9%, and the EU at 3.2%. All of them together don't even match China's incremental growth. That's staggering by any measure, and as Americans, we have to ask ourselves why we're not keeping up. What are they doing that we're not? What's the secret? But sheer volume isn't enough, and this is where most people get it completely wrong. Electricity isn't like rice or wheat or barrels of oil. You can't stockpile it in a warehouse for a rainy day or a heat wave. It has to balance in real time every second, every microsecond, or the whole system goes haywire. It's just-in-time delivery, not inventory you can store and draw from later. If power is generated and not used or transmitted instantly, it's wasted forever, or worse, it can overload and melt the entire grid, causing cascading failures that take days or even weeks to restore fully. In early July, when multiple regions in China hit peak loads simultaneously, their dispatch remained rock solid, not because turbines spin faster or because they have more coal stockpiles, but because their system is designed for coordination, not chaos. From the top down, India's generation keeps hitting record highs year after year, yet they still have massive blackouts during every heat wave because the power can't physically reach the people who need it most. Their grid is decrepit, aging, and full of bottlenecks, with transmission losses hitting 25% nationally. In some states, over 50% of generated power just vanishes into thin air, lost to heat and resistance before it ever reaches a single light bulb. That brings us to the real game changer, China's ultra-high voltage transmission technology, which is the key that unlocks everything else. Here's China's geographic curse: over 80% of their energy. Wind from the vast plains of Xinjiang, coal from Inner Mongolia's rich deposits, hydro from the towering dams of Sichuan is concentrated in the west and north, far from where people actually live. But over 70% of demand is in the east and central regions, the smart factories, the office towers. The dense residential megacities, thousands of miles away from the energy sources, separated by mountains, deserts, and rivers. If you use ordinary transmission lines, losses are so bad that by the time power reaches Shanghai or Guangzhou, barely anything's left. It would bankrupt any operator and make the whole exercise pointless. That's where USG comes in and changes the game entirely. Think of it as the hyperloop of electricity. Regular lines are like old freight trains: slow, limited loads, high leakage, constantly needing maintenance. USG runs at extreme voltages, delivering massive power over thousands of miles with minimal loss. We're talking loss rates under 5%, which is revolutionary, slamming it right into eastern cities with almost no waste. China is the only country in the world running USG at full commercial scale, period. End of story. The US started eyeing this technology back in 1967, but we never got it off the ground. The Soviets built test lines in 1985, but they couldn't make it work. Japan tried a few dozen miles of experimental lines and they gave up too. They all abandoned it. Why? Because USG is just about throwing money at it. It demands an entire industrial ecosystem, advanced materials science, mega project engineering, and national level coordination that almost no one else can pull off. You need everything from specialized transformers, the size of buildings, to ultra-pure copper conductors, to real-time monitoring systems that track thousands of variables. It's a whole industrial web that only one country has fully woven together. By summer of 2026, China had built and put into operation 45 USG transmission corridors, with total line length exceeding 40,000 miles, enough to circle the Earth at the equator. With plenty left over, in this field, China writes the rules. Over 90% of all global USG projects are in China, and 85% of relevant international standards set by the International Electrotechnical Commission, the global authority, were actually drafted and pushed through by the Chinese themselves. That's not just participation, that's dominance. And it gives them enormous leverage in global energy infrastructure, a leverage they're not shy about using. If EHG is the technical ace up their sleeve, here's the real anchor, the thing that makes it all stick and work in the real world. Many outsiders see EHG and want to copy it, but they can't. And the main reason isn't technology. It's their own systems and the way they're structured. In the US and Europe, grids are privatized and heavily fragmented. America alone has literally thousands of utilities, each with its own fiefdom, with 3 major interconnections that barely talk to each other and have different frequencies and standards. Texas, for example, has almost zero cross-border links with neighboring states. There, essentially an island when it comes to power sharing by design to avoid federal regulation. They save money by not building expensive interstate lines. Then when extreme weather hits, they can't borrow a single megawatt from anyone else. Not even a neighbor sitting right next door. Permitting a single cross-state transmission line takes 8 to 15 years. That's a generation of bureaucracy, environmental reviews, lawsuits, and political squabbles. And private companies sure aren't going to pay for infrastructure that benefits their competitors instead of their own bottom line. When crisis comes, nobody saves anybody. It's every utility for itself, every state for itself. In a heat wave, Texas prices skyrocket. Remember those jaw-dropping monthly bills over $10,000 during that winter storm a few years back. 2026, same old script, same old pain. Heat hits, prices spike, and conservation pleas trend all over local news while people sweat it out, wondering why nobody planned ahead. Now contrast that with China. On any project that affects people's daily lives, especially essentials like power and water, their state-owned system shows its muscle in ways we can't replicate. The grid is government-owned and government-operated, built from day one not primarily for profit, but to serve 1.4 billion people and the national interest. They run nationwide coordination, moving power across provinces like it's nothing, treating the whole country as one integrated system. And here's a fact that blows my mind every time I think about it. China is one of the very few countries in the world where residential electricity rates are lower than industrial rates, which is basically the opposite of how we do things for over a decade. No matter how much global energy prices have swung, oil spikes, gas shortages, supply chain chaos from wars and pandemics, their household rates have barely budged. Still around 7 cents per kilowatt hour, the lowest among major global economies, about 1/5 of what Germans pay and about half of what we pay in many parts of the US. How does that work? Industry subsidizes households. The state effectively puts a floor under people's basic electricity bills, treating access to power as a public good, not a commodity to be squeezed for maximum profit. Even more stunning, if you live deep in the mountains, the only house for miles around, Any capitalist utility in America would say running a line to you is a money-losing bet that will never pay back. They'd leave you in the dark or force you to pay a fortune for a private solar setup. But in China, the power company will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars crossing cliffs, mountains, and rivers if needed, building towers in impossible terrain just to get you connected to the grid. Is that irrational from a pure profit perspective? Sure, absolutely. But I'd argue it's not stupid because stable, affordable electricity is the ultimate poverty killer and the final insurance policy against social instability. When people have lights, refrigeration, and internet, they can educate their kids, run small businesses, connect to the outside world, and participate in the economy. It's a social multiplier that pays back in ways that don't show up on quarterly earnings reports. That's exactly why their nationwide reliability rate hits 99.924%. Cities like Hangzhou and Ningbo see less than 10 minutes of total outage per year, and even rural areas see outages measured in hours, not days for us in the US, with our aging infrastructure and balkanized system, where some rural areas still rely on lines from the 1950s and transformers that are past their lifespan. That number is almost unimaginable. We're talking about a level of consistency that most Americans simply don't experience and probably don't believe is possible. Mainstream media used to call China the king of coal, and yeah, they burned a lot of it. No question. But check the latest data because the story has changed dramatically. Over the past decade, coal's share of total installed capacity dropped from 61% all the way down to 32%, effectively cut in half in just 10 years. Non-fossil clean energy now accounts for over 62% for the first time. Wind and solar alone hit 48.1%, officially surpassing traditional thermal power and capacity for the first time in history. Now, new coal plants are mostly built as backup to balance wind and solar fluctuations. Think of them as insurance policies, not primary drivers. Sitting idle most of the time and firing up only when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. For every 3 kilowatt hours they use, nearly 2 come from wind, solar, and other clean sources. That's a major shift that most people outside China don't fully appreciate, and it happened in just a single decade faster than anyone predicted. And they're not keeping this tech at home there, exporting it aggressively, building influence and market share one transformer at a time. Take Brazil, they have the same geographic dilemma China faced, massive hydro resources in the north, but demand is 2,000 miles south in coastal cities. They tried for decades to solve it and couldn't. In 2014, China State Grid won the contract for the Belo Monte OSGDC project, bringing 800 kilovolt technology to South America, cutting through the Amazon rainforest, and building the longest EOSD line in the world at the time, all while navigating environmental regulations and local politics. That's not just engineering, that's geopolitical savvy and execution on a scale that's hard to fathom. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. State Grid now operates 13 core energy networks in 10 countries, including the Philippines, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Chile, all profitable, by the way, which shows this isn't charity or aid. It's smart business that delivers returns. In 2025, China's transformer exports hit 64.6 billion yuan, that's roughly $9 billion US dollars, up nearly 36% year over year, a staggering growth rate in a mature industry. Saudi Arabia, of all places, placed a massive 16.4 billion yuan order, about $2.3 billion for 179 ultra-high voltage transformers, all specified to be Chinese made, because they deliver in 6 to 9 months and undercut competitors by 30 to 40% in price while matching or exceeding them in quality. That's serious market muscle, and it's reshaping global energy infrastructure right under our noses, changing who controls the flow of power around the world. And they haven't stopped innovating. They're already looking past the horizon, past UHD, past coal, past even solar and wind. China's 15th five-year plan is pouring substantial funding, billions upon billions of dollars, into hydrogen energy and nuclear fusion, aiming to blow through every capacity ceiling we currently know and leapfrog into entirely new energy paradigms. They're not just playing catch-up, they're aiming for the next leap entirely, betting that fusion could be the ultimate answer to humanity's energy needs. And they're funding it at levels that would make the US Department of Energy blush. Whether that pays off or not in the next decade or two, the sheer scale of their ambition is worth paying attention to because they're not waiting for anyone else to lead. So look, I am not here to cheerlead for anyone. I am an American calling it like I see it. And I don't wave anyone's flag but my own. But when we see our own grids strain every summer and winter, our own regulators warn of daily blackouts within a few years. and our own utilities fail to coordinate across state lines while shareholders demand dividends. While another country keeps the lights on for 1.4 billion people through extreme weather, with lower prices and cleaner energy, we need to wake up and face reality. This isn't about politics or ideology or which system is morally superior. It's about infrastructure, strategy, and national will. And right now, by any objective measure, we're falling behind in a race. We didn't even realize we were in a race for energy security that underpins every other advantage we think we have, from military power to economic dominance to technological leadership. All right, that's the real picture. No sugarcoating, no spin, no fluff. This isn't about fear-mongering. It's about facing facts and asking hard questions about where we go from here. Catch you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay cool, and think about what keeps your lights on.